Welcome to The Writer's Dream. This is a show where authors can talk about how they write their books, how they publish their books, and how they market their books. I'm Linda Maria Frank. I'm the author of Annie Tillery Mysteries. You can find us on Facebook. Just look for The Writer's Dream. We are also on YouTube. If you want to see us on YouTube, there are about 125 interviews now on YouTube, and there are some very interesting tips for writers and readers. All you have to do is search my name, Linda Maria Frank, and click on my picture, and my videos will come up. If you have a question for The Writer's Dream, please message me on the Facebook page, The Writer's Dream. Today's guest is Joel Harris, and he is the author of Public Parts, and our host today is Jack Bolello.
Thank you, Linda, and welcome, Joel.
Thank you.
I want to tell you that I read Public Parts, and I found it extremely interesting, and the writing I thought was top-notch, absolutely first-rate. And the subject is something close to my own heart, because although the setting for the most part is in Brownsville, Brooklyn, I grew up in East New York, Brooklyn, so many of the characters that appear in your novel were familiar to me through my father, who lived through that era. But I wanted to ask you, what was the motivation for you to write this book?
Well, first of all, let me tell you, I thank you for the opportunity, okay? And I also have read your book. I still love Joni James, which takes place in the next village of East New York, and I found it very interesting and entertaining, and very, very, very nice. Thank you. Anyway, it's something that I always wanted to do, even as a child. I was always motivated to write. I've been writing for like 70 years, and at some point I felt I had a story to tell. And I put the story together over a period of time, and I felt that I wanted to leave something for posterity. Maybe it's a little ego trip on my part, but as somebody said to me once, people live like they'll never die, then they die like they've never lived, and I didn't want that. I wanted to have something for my children, my grandchildren, something for posterity, a little marker. This was dead. This is what he did. And so I wrote it.
Good, very good. Good enough reason for anyone who aspires to be a writer. And it took you 20 years. So what was the time frame, and why did it take that length of time, Joel?
Well, okay, during that period of time, I actually finished the book 5 times, maybe 6 times, and letting it lie fallow for a while, and then going back to it and realizing that it wasn't finished. There were scenes missing. The more you get into it, the more you realize what still has to be done. And yeah, it's 20, 21, 22 years, right? And then there was a period of time when I was submitting to agents and built a huge pile of rejection slips. I never took them personally. You know, they were just busy people. And then I decided finally to self-publish. And I asked around, and I found that Ex Libris was reputed to do a good job. I engaged them, and the rest is history.
Yes, and the book is, in large measure, historical fiction. The good part of the history is true because you have some fascinating, unsavory, of course, underworld characters, but nonetheless they were real and part of our lives growing up in those neighborhoods and those areas. For example, Abe Reles is a very important subject in the book, even though he's not a character because he's been dead since 1941. But tell us a little about Abe Reles, what he did, and how he died.
Okay, well, I have to remember that I'm a few years older than you, and when I saw this headline, okay, in the Brooklyn Eagle, I remembered it. Basically from that particular period of time, and I felt that there was a story that had to be told. So I use him as the beginning, the unsolved mystery, and the entire arc of the story revolves around what happened when Abe Reles went out the window. And at the end, the truth, such as it is revealed, and everything else in between is how we got there, how we got to that point.
Well, before he went out the window, tell us about who he was, what he did, and what led to him becoming the canary who could sing but could not fly as he went out that sixth floor window of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island.
Right, and found the one law that he could not evade, the law of gravity.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Anyway, no, he was a local hoodlum who rose through the ranks, became a major rub-out guy, a paid killer for hire, whose favorite method was ice pick in the ear, scramble the brain, unsolvable, because no marks are left and nobody knows what happened. There's no blood involved. It was good for him. Anyway, as the feds were closing in on the mob and the state people also, he decided to save his life and turn state's witness, turn into one of the greatest snitches who ever lived. He had a wife at home. He had one child. His wife was pregnant. He didn't want to die. So he was telling all. But unfortunately, there were people out there who really wanted to see him dead because of what he knew. And eventually, the rumor went, they tossed him out the window to silence him. He was supposed to testify that day on a murder trial of Albert Anastasia. He was the only witness, and because he was dead, there was no trial. And he was also supposed to go to the West Coast and do the number on, who am I thinking of?
Bugsy Siegel?
Bugsy Siegel, yeah. And so he didn't do that either. So he very conveniently passed away, gone.
He passed away.
Listen, I mean,
he passed away.
That's a good generic term, you know. He passed on.
Yes. And of course, not only did he pass on by being thrown out that window, but he was responsible for the first and only mob leader ever to be executed in the electric chair. And who was that?
That would be Lepke Buckhalter.
Yeah, never before or since has a mob leader been executed. But as you mentioned, he was supposed to testify against Albert Anastasia.
Yeah.
Who was Albert Anastasia, and ultimately what happened to him?
Albert Anastasia was a mob boss. He had usury, he had betting, he had prostitutions, he had all kinds of other interesting business careers. His brother, Tough Tony Anastasia, was the president of the Teamsters Union at that time.
The Brooklyn Docks.
Yeah. It was a whole family. And so he did not stand trial, so he was never convicted of the murder that he was suspected of doing, but they got him about 14, 15 years later at the Sheraton Hotel in New York. He was getting a haircut and a shave, and some people came in and blew him away. That's another unsolved mystery. But when the bad guys meet theirs, there's very little motivation on the part of the authorities to find out who did it. It's a matter of, invent a term, it's a matter of social convenience. You like that one?
Yes. Now, Albert Anastasia was apparently the head of Murder Incorporated. What was Murder Incorporated?
Well, he was one of the heads. Actually, Murder Incorporated was a contracting firm when people in the mob wanted other people erased, to use another term, for their convenience. They needed somebody to do the job. And Murder Incorporated were contract killers. Even to this day, the term doing a contract, okay, survived the actual fact that they were doing contracts. You rub out this guy, we'll pay you so much money. And certain people, chief among them was Ali Tic-Tac Tannenbaum, who would travel the country to track down the people that certain people wanted eliminated, and he would eliminate them and go on his way. By the way, interesting footnote to history, he never used the same revolver twice. When he used the gun once, he disposed of it so that there was never any way to trace it back to him. Very clever. But he was a clever guy.
You know, interesting. You know, most people in the common folklore think that the mafia and so on, and the Italian mob and so on. But in this book, you reveal that there maybe were at least as much, if not more, Jewish gangsters and mobsters than there were Italian, or at least as much. For example, my neighborhood, you had Happy Maione and Dash Abendando, who were part of Murder Incorporated, as well as Albert Anastasia. But there was scores of Jewish gangsters other than Abe Relis, and they were very prominent in crime in that period of time.
Yeah.
Why do you think that's so, that both the Italians and the Jews were so prominent in crime?
Yeah, okay, it was an era when all of these people had foreign-born parents, okay? And as Larry mentions, my hero mentions at some point, that the previous generation got the Jews out of the ghettos, and this generation got the ghetto out of the Jews. That they found that the Jews could be just as tough as anybody else. They were capable of being just as mean and just as bad. That piety and religion was not their only fate, that they could do other things. And this was an era where everything branched out. There was a group that became murderers and racketeers. There was another group that became accountants and doctors and lawyers, you know. So it depended, I suppose, on circumstances, you know, because some of the bad guys were really very bright, and some of the very successful guys were really very dumb.
For example, Meyer Lansky is another good example of really a brilliant man who was also notorious gangster.
Yeah, but his early interaction as a child with Lucky Luciano helped shape him into the gangster that he later became, and the fact that he was a very bright guy and unbelievably trustworthy enabled him to rise through the ranks to become ultimately one of the leaders in what was at that point the Bugs and Myers gang, which was superseded by Murder Incorporated when Albert Anastasia came into the picture and the whole thing. But it was basically a triumvirate, each person claiming to be the boss, but the three of them were running it together.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned Albert Anastasia and what happened to him and his brother, Tough Tony Anastasia, gangsters and really tough guys. The third brother became a Roman Catholic priest. I guess you could consider him the black sheep in that family, you know. So
I didn't know that. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's always something else to learn. Appreciate that.
In any event, the book is laden and cleverly done with a lot of great Yiddish expressions that I learned when I worked in the Garment Center in the summers. And you do that very, very, very cleverly, and I appreciated that. So there's some lessons in this book about the language and the use of language and philology, the study of language. But there's also some very philosophical thoughts in an interesting way, not in a philosophical text or treatise, but for example, you do have a flirtation with existentialism to the extent that there are people engage in activities and commit themselves to activities with no promise of reward or guarantee of success, and yet they do it at great risk and so on. And I thought that was quite interesting. You deal with a father and son relationship, and that I think was quite interesting. Big Mo and his son Larry, did they love each other? Did they respect each other? Were they in conflict with each other? Did the father feel his son was a failure? Did the son feel his father had gone overboard in the lifestyle? Can you explain how you developed that relationship?
Well, I think that all father and son relationships have a matter of tension in them. It's built into who we are, okay? The father is very reluctant to relinquish his role as leader and the son basically feels entitled at some point to become the leader. So, and also, so there's conflict there. Also, they're brought up in different eras. The father is continually making reference to, mentally, to a bygone era, and the son is living in the present, and they're different. So the father and the son have different ideas of how to go forward, different ideas of how to make a living, different ideas of how to conduct themselves in public, even different ideas how to dress, and we see that now with my children and my grandchildren. And basically, it's very hard to communicate because we come from different places, even if we're related generationally.
Yeah. It reminded me, seeing that movie with Tom Hanks, The Road to Perdition, the conflict between father and son. The father's a gangster, a murderer, an assassin, and his son loves his father, but he cannot take to his father's lifestyle. And then when the father was murdered at the end, and his son said, when people ask me about my father, was he a gangster, was he mean, was he evil, was he tough? He said, hey, he was my father. And the way he said it, like he said, he was my father. There was a lot of love in that relationship. And the difference, like you say, between, like Abe Reles had a child, right?
Yeah, two.
And loved, and apparently loved his children.
Yeah.
And it's quite, John Gotti, for example, his daughter lives in Oyster Bay, and she's fashioned a very nice career for herself as a writer, as luck would have it. And his grandchildren are doing very well in school and so on. So that I thought was an interesting take on your book. I love the other references. For example, you make reference to Tennessee Williams and the Glass Menagerie. I mean, these are things that you would not expect coming out of a novel based on criminal activity and so on. I like you have a line in there that loyalty is power, and power is loyalty. I like that line. That that, and you could see the trends that we have in current political situation.
Yeah.
Where there are people like our president apparently demanding loyalty above all.
Yeah.
And there's a great expression, a great Roman expression, loyalty above all, except for the truth. Except for the truth. There's one higher endeavor, and that's the truth over loyalty. But that idea of loyalty comes out very, very clearly and forcefully in your book.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned what you said, because that's something we have to remember today. It's a very, very current problem.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The more things change, the more they remain the same. So the things that had occurred in different venues exist today in the political realm, the business realm, in many realms, and especially today more than I recall in the longest time, that loyalty is demanded, including loyalty above the truth. And that is something I think that is a lesson for all of us to consider. I like one of the things, some of the lines in there, and that do accountants really dream of roasting a former client from time to time? You were an accountant. You were in the business. You were
insurance broker.
Yeah.
But yeah, I dealt with a lot of accountants over the years, and yes, there are some. Basically, every accountant has to use a mob term, has to go to the mat for his clients from time to time. Accountants are under continual pressure to stretch reality, to fit certain situations, so that, to minimize taxes, to not create issues with the IRS and all this kind of stuff. And an accountant will walk a very, very thin line between doing a favor and committing a crime, And what happens is, after years and years of sweating it out, that the client suddenly finds himself a new guy, and the accountant that has done all these favors is no longer the accountant. And yes, at that particular point, I think if he had the chance to get back at somebody that he really worked very hard to protect over the years, I think he would. And a few times I've seen it happen. So yeah,